What is going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be talking about some of the issues in the game currently in regards to bloom or bullet spread, why it often feels like some of your shots are missing when they shouldn't be, as well as some tips and tricks on how you can actually get more shots on target, at least until they put out a fix for the current issues with the game. I'm going to be going over the bloom and what it actually does for those who are unaware, and then at the end I'll give you guys some actual comparisons of what the bloom and recoil are doing to your shots compared to what it looks like when you use some of the tips at the end to get more shots on target. Before we get into it, if you guys are new to the channel, then consider subscribing and turning on those notifications. But with that being said, let's get stuck right into it. So I've been getting a ton of comments lately asking about aiming and accuracy in Battlefield 2042 and why it feels like a lot of the time you're shooting someone and it just doesn't really feel like it's hitting them, when on your screen it definitely looks like it should be. This issue is mostly prevalent with the assault rifles in the game, as well as a little bit with the LMGs too, while the SMGs seem to be affected a lot less by it, and the marksman rifles are almost completely unaffected by it, so it is making the game feel a little bit unbalanced in certain areas. The reason for this is that the bloom mechanics in the game seem to be somewhat bugged or just maybe over the top on these weapons, causing a lot of shots to just not really go where you're aiming. Now, for those who are unaware of what bloom is, it's essentially another word for bullet spread, and the best way to describe it is actually just to show you guys an example of it when I'm hip firing. It's essentially one of the principles of hip firing. It's been in shooters forever, and it's pretty much in the game for balancing reasons, so that you obviously just can't shoot from the hip and be completely accurate. Obviously right here, the dot in the very center of the screen is just an indicator of the middle, yet those four lines on the outside are pretty much showing you the area in which your bullets will be spread when shooting from the hip. As I shoot though, you can see those four lines spreading further and further apart, and that is exactly what bloom is. It's the widening of the bullet spread, which generally happens when you hold down the trigger, and it can even happen when moving in certain games, which you can actually see here as well. When I've come out of a sprint, the crosshairs are somewhat spread out and then they sort of close in after you've stopped. Now, like I said, this is really normal for hipfire. It's in pretty much every shooter ever, and it's just how they balance the gameplay. However, it has actually made its way into the ADS gunplay as well, so when you aim down sights, there is still some level of bloom, which isn't always the case. You can see when I'm ADSing here with the M5A3 that a lot of the traces aren't actually going exactly where the red dot is aiming. They're slightly skewing off to the side or slightly above or below the dot, and this is where the accuracy issue comes from, that sometimes you'll shoot at someone and a bullet that should have hit them simply goes straight past them, making a lot of players, myself included, feel like they're missing shots that they shouldn't be. Now, many games do have bloom with ADS as well. It's not like this is a first by any means, but in this current build of the game, it just appears to be slightly more powerful than the devs intended it to be. It wasn't like this in the beta, and it doesn't appear to be like this with weapons like the PP29, for example. And so, although bloom in ADS can be okay if it's done properly, it's definitely not okay if it's not done properly. Anyway, like I said, the devs have mentioned that they intend to fix this, so hopefully in a week or two it could be sorted once we get the next update. But for now, I still wanted to make a video on some tips on how to control the bloom a little bit better, because it is still pretty frustrating right now and it is sort of ruining the game for a lot of people. So we're going to go over a few ways that you guys can improve your accuracy. Now, keep in mind, these tips aren't necessarily for how to aim better, as in moving the sticks and getting on target easier or anything like that. These are just how to hit more shots when you are already on target. Aiming accuracy and bullet accuracy is slightly different things, so just keep that in mind throughout the rest of the video. So firstly, this is just me firing the M5A3 with no recoil control and without taking my finger off the trigger from 25 meters away. You can see just how much recoil there is, and the longer I hold the trigger down, the worse the accuracy is towards the end. So you can imagine at a bit of a longer range, many of those shots would probably miss my target even if the red dot was actually still aiming at the enemy. Next up though, you can see that by tapping the trigger rather than holding it down, the accuracy of the weapon is a hell of a lot better. It's still not ideal, but it is definitely more accurate than just holding down the trigger. And so that right there is step number one to becoming more accurate at any range other than close range. You want to tap the trigger rather than simply holding it. Now, the next step that you can take is doing some recoil control to stop the weapon from bouncing so high in the air when you shoot. Now, I'm not even that great at aiming and accuracy in all honesty, but I get a lot of comments on videos asking how I keep the recoil down so much, and I'll give you guys some tips on how to do that right now. Firstly, a large part of it is actually just in the settings. You want to go to your display settings and you want to put ADS field of view on, and this kind of depends whether you play on a higher FOV or not, but if you do play on a higher FOV, this is a game changer. With this turned off, it'll zoom you in way too much, and the visual recoil of the gun is going to be really hard to handle, yet you can see here that when I turn the ADS field of view on, the recoil looks like it is so much less simply because the screen is essentially a little bit zoomed out. Now, the actual recoil of the gun is identical, it doesn't actually add or remove any recoil, but visually it's just a lot harder to control when you've got this turned off. So some of you guys might not like it, but I would definitely just recommend to at least try it out. It will make things zoomed out, so if you do struggle with vision, then it might not be the best, but you can already see just how much it makes your recoil feel much less prevalent than normal. Now, after you've done that, and this is just how you actually control recoil rather than just visually changing it, you want to pull down on the thumbstick slightly as you're shooting. The recoil obviously makes you sort of aim up in the air, so if you just slightly pull down on your stick, or if you're on PC, the same principle applies, just drag your mouse down on the mouse pad, and this will sort of counterbalance the recoil, meaning you can almost stay in the same spot at all times. This does take a lot of practice, and in the heat of battle it can still be super hard to do even if you're pretty adept at it, but you can just see the drastic difference here. This first clip is me just holding down the trigger with no recoil, and then the second clip I'm holding down the trigger but just controlling the recoil as best as I can, and obviously the more you practice the better you'll get. Now, those are sort of two different techniques, tapping the trigger to stop the spread and then also using recoil control, but the main difference you'll get is when you actually just combine both of these techniques in order to get the best of both worlds. This first clip here is just me holding down the trigger, my right thumb is completely off the stick, so I'm just letting it go, and then this second clip here is me combining the recoil control and just tapping the trigger as well, and just look at the night and day difference in accuracy, not only in the recoil itself, but the spread of the bullets is also just a lot less, and yeah, you can instantly see a complete difference in accuracy simply from two pretty easy techniques. Now, lastly, I just wanted to show the absolute worst case scenario for Bloom, compared to that same technique but in a crouch position, which is essentially the best case scenario outside of proning with a bipod. The absolute worst case scenario for Bloom is when you're jumping around, strafing side to side and holding down the trigger with no recoil control. You can see just how much the bullets are spreading here, and honestly, you may as well just be hip firing in this situation because it is probably going to be about the same amount of accuracy. Then you can see that when I stop moving and crouch, which also helps keep the bloom tighter, and employ those same techniques I mentioned earlier in tapping the trigger and using recoil control, just look at the absolute insane difference in accuracy here from these shots compared to the previous shots. Now, that right there is obviously best case versus worst case, so I know that's not quite the best example of how accurate you can actually be. In a proper battle, you're still going to be strafing and find yourself holding the trigger sometimes, so it's never really going to be that accurate as it was in the example, but it just shows how much of a difference that really does make, and so hopefully that helps you guys out a bit with those bloom issues. I'd recommend just setting up a portal server like I've done here and just jumping in without any players or bots to test it out, get the hang of it with each weapon and just sort of see how some of these tips feel, especially the setting changes with the ADS field of view, and then you can even jump into the solo conquest mode where it's just you versus bots and get the hang of it even further in that mode before jumping into an online setting. Like I said, this is something that DICE are planning on tuning up anyway within the next couple of weeks, but regardless, even once they fix the bloom up a little bit, these techniques won't be redundant by any means. These are techniques that you should be using in as many gunfights as you can. Obviously 5 meters away you just want to hold the trigger down and hope for the best, but in a sort of mid-range gunfight or even relatively close like these examples at about 25 meters, these techniques that I mentioned are definitely something you should be getting used to and trying to do as often as possible. That is going to do it for this one though, guys. Obviously, to many of you who are a little bit more experienced as shooters, this is somewhat basic stuff, but I know a lot of people are going to be really new to all of this stuff. We all start somewhere, and so hopefully this did help some of you guys out, as I know missing shots that you should be hitting is something that can be genuinely game breaking for a lot of people. If you enjoyed the video, then be sure to leave a like down below, and if you are new, then consider subscribing to the channel with those notifications on. I've got plenty more tips and tricks videos like this on the way, so be sure to keep your eyes peeled for more. If you guys want to support the content that I make here on YouTube, then consider becoming a channel member. But with that being said, thank you all very much for watching. You guys have a great day, and I'll see you all out there on the battlefield.